All right, welcome to Discord Q&A number 19. I have some new lighting you might see. I got a ring light, as many people recommended to me, and now I don't have to deal with either doing this in the dark or using the extremely hot lamp that I used to have, which kind of cooked my face while I was sitting here. If I wasn't, making these videos during the nighttime. Anyway, that stuff aside, quick intro before I actually get into the video itself. One thing I was talking about on my stream last weekend that I thought might be relevant for videos is that I have no problem with people disagreeing with me, right? I've had a lot of people talking with me about like, oh, I disagree with you about this point, and some people, will come to me afterwards and say like, oh yeah, sorry for disagreeing with you, or like, oh, I hope that's okay. It's like it's totally okay with disagree with me, right? First of all, I can just be wrong. I'm not perfect, right? I don't want people to take these answers in this video as like the absolute truth or the word of law or anything like that, right? I'm just a guy, for one. And for two, keep in mind, I'm not spending a lot of time thinking super deeply about my answers to these, right? There's probably a good number of answers, probably like, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the questions I've answered, I would guess, that if I were to go back and redo every single question that I've answered in these videos, I'd probably answer them a fair bit differently if I thought about it a lot more. But the way that I kind of view these videos is, to me, a lot of the value is more about explaining my thought process and like getting quick answers to sort of low hanging fruit questions, more so than everything being perfectly correct. Right. The way I think about it is, if I was trying to give you the highest quality possible answers to every single question in these videos, I would have made, at this point, I'm making video number 19. I probably would have made like 3 or 4 videos at this point in the same amount of time, maybe even less than that, right? Because it takes a lot of time to sort of think things out completely and like get a really high quality answer and all of those things. And ultimately, one of the things I will say is important as a game designer is I think it's important to be able to recognize that, not only can you be wrong, but when you are wrong, right? And there are definitely some things in the past where it's like, I look back and I'm like, yeah, I was just wrong about this thing. And that's okay, right? I think if you're not able to admit you're wrong, you're not going to be a very good game designer. And all this having been said, it's totally okay to disagree with me. However, there is a difference between disagreeing with me in a respectful way and disagreeing with me and just telling me I'm an idiot. It's like, I'm not obviously not going to engage if you tell me, dumbass, you are like a complete idiot. Why don't you think about this thing? It's like, even if you're right, which, I can't really say I've ever seen any comments like that where I actually thought the person was right. Maybe there have been some. I don't really tend to look at them very much. But regardless, there's a very big difference between saying, hey, I disagree with you on this point, and I think that there's this other consideration you weren't thinking about, or have you thought about this other this other angle, or this other way of thinking about this thing, or this other metric that you might use, or whatever. Totally fine. I've had plenty of conversations with people where they're disagreeing with me, and sometimes I my opinion doesn't change, sometimes it does, right? I think it's important to be able to change your opinion when you're exposed to new information. It's another thing that's good for anyone, not just game designers. I highly recommend that in your life. But if you're leaving a comment on my video or DMing me or something like that, and you're telling me that I'm an idiot or that doing something unreasonable, that is not going to fly. So just keep that in mind when you're responding to me, leaving comments, whatever. Anyway, getting on to the actual video itself, let's start out with question number 1. Is there any chance that Nora from Wild Rift could come to PC League? Short answer is yes. I think it's possible. How likely do I think it is? I'm not actually sure. One thing I'll note here is that I don't know how successful Nora has been in Wild Rift, but the reality is, if Nora is a successful champion in Wild Rift, right? Like, let's suppose that she's, in the top, I don't know, 20 pick rate champions in Wild Rift 6 months after her launch. I'm just making up metrics here, right? Don't take this as exact numbers, but let's suppose that she's just a fairly successful champion in Wild Rift. I think we would consider exploring, what does she look like in PC League. One thing I do want to note here is that Nora was built intentionally for Wild Rift, and so uses the considerations of the controls there. I think particularly her ultimate is something that would be very difficult to make work in its current form from Wild Rift. And so there's a version of this where, hey, say Nora is really successful in Wild Rift, we try her out in PC League, and our conclusion is, actually, when we make this ultimate work in PC, she doesn't feel like Nora anymore, or we don't think she'll be as good, and then we decide not to do her. There's also a version where we try her out, we find a version that is really good for PC, and we just ship that, right? The ultimate answer here is yes, absolutely there is a chance. I don't know what percentage chance that is. Several things have to happen. She probably has to be successful in Wild Rift. We have to find a version of her kit that works really well for PC League, and we have to think that that actually still lines up and still feels like Nora and all of those things. But it's definitely possible, right? I'm just not sure exactly what the sort of odds of that happening actually are, but for sure a possibility. Is there a set limit of how much can be pushed through a patch, or is it just what makes it on time? Basically, the summary of what they were getting at here was, are big changes intentionally held for big patches, or is it just the result of scope? So I'll talk through a couple of different things here. There are cases where we decide something isn't going to make it into a patch and we push it back. This is, however, not some physical limit of like the size of our patches or anything like that. Usually, what happens when we push something back in a patch is that we put something into a patch that either has higher than initially estimated QA requirements to ship, or we put it into the patch without knowing that we were going to be doing it ahead of time, and it has QA requirements that we don't think that we can meet before the patch actually ends up shipping off, right? This is something that happens from time to time. Like, let's suppose we're halfway through a patch cycle, someone decides that they want to rescript a champion's spell or something like that. We'll often end up delaying that to the following patch, or maybe even multiple patches from that, there, because rescripting a whole champion spell requires a lot of QA resources to make sure that it actually is working exactly the way that we want it to, and it doesn't have, we're not introducing new bugs, things like that, right? And so this is a case where, if you think back in the day of like, oh, there was this, this bug that was recognized and someone said they had a fix and it, didn't ship for several patches from now. This has happened to me several times where I'm like, yeah, I have a fix for this thing. And I tell someone like, yeah, I fixed that thing, 2 days ago or, a week ago or whatever. And then it doesn't ship until the patch after. Sometimes that's because the QA resources just weren't there, right? The reality is we can get QA resources pretty easily if we want to ship a really big patch, but we need to know that a sufficient amount ahead of time. And so when things come in fairly late in the patch cycle, we won't always have the resources to actually QA. Oh, I guess I should explain. For those of you not familiar, QA is quality assurance. This is basically testers going through and making sure that the thing actually works the way that it's supposed to. Sorry, forgot to actually go through that explanation for people who are not familiar with the terminology. Anyway, but the QA resources are often why things might get pushed like one or two patches back, just because we don't want to ship new bugs if we can avoid it, or we don't want to like ship unintended outcomes, that kind of thing. That's the main, I think, most common occurrence of when we push something back in a patch because of like, I wouldn't say like size constraints, but more so just like testing constraints. However, there definitely are cases where we hold a change for a specific big patch. Not that we will just hold random changes that have no impact, no relation to the big patch, but we will sometimes hold changes that we think will go well with something, in that big patch, right? As an example, if you look back to last year, towards the end of last year, there were very few changes to 80 carries, especially crit 80 carries, towards the end of last year. There were a few changes that actually some people on the live pod wanted to ship, but we decided to just not do them then and just bundle them with the crit 80 carry changes we were doing at the beginning of this season, because we knew we were buffing crit damage at the beginning of the season. And so the conclusion was, well, why do this now when we can get a much better understanding of like how it's going to interact with things, and like we don't have to deal with the fallout of this thing. We don't have to worry about balancing it, and then immediately having to rebalance it in the following patch. Let's just bundle it all up and do it as part of those tuning changes, and try to get a better read on the stuff for the beginning of the season. Stuff like that happens pretty frequently, where someone wants to change something, or someone has a project to change something that is related in some way to something else that's being worked on in one of our larger patches. In that case, we will often hold the change until that larger patch, if that makes sense. But that's the main reason why we hold things for bigger patches, is not because we just want to make the big patch bigger, but more so because we're doing something that just makes more sense to ship as a package deal with something else that we're already working on, if that makes sense. So that's sort of my summary. Is it definitely does happen that sometimes we just push something back because we don't have the time to QA, to get it through QA. But most of the time we're holding something, it's because it's related in some form or fashion to some stuff that we're already planning on shipping in a larger patch. Has the game balance team ever looked at potentially giving Xin some changes to let him top? A couple things I'll note here. Number one is that the game balance team, which I think most people would consider the live pod to be that, though they do more than just balance, is not the team that typically does role changes. They do some, right? Like they are, sometimes they're doing projects to like open up a champion to a new role, but it's actually more common for either people working on the seasonal pod, like which what we did for the season 2 changes. Which if you've seen them, there's stuff like AP Ezreal, AD, Crit Kennen, and stuff like that that are coming in the split 2 pack, the S2 package this year. Was done by the seasonal pod, or even the champions team, right? Doing things like this, say like a champion designer saying, "Hey, I made this champion. I think they should be open to this other role. Didn't do that in the past for whatever reason, and we'll open them up now, or whatever." Right. So, short part of this is like the live pod does not is probably less than 1/3 of role opening up, so I wouldn't really consider them to be the team of choice here. But regardless, let's talk about Xin Top. Interestingly enough, this person asked this question, I think weeks ago at this point, right? Because the doc is super backed up because I get way more questions than I have the ability to answer per week. But we actually have Xin changes on the PB right now that are going to be shipping in S2 that are not necessarily directly intended to let him lane, but the designer that worked on them was essentially targeting, hey, if this is good in lane, that's cool, but I'm mostly trying to open up extra builds. And if that has the side effect of opening up to more lanes, that's also cool, as long as it's not as long as it's not degenerate, right? Something I'll say is that we've worked on Xin a number of times over the years, and I was actually involved in a number of those projects back when I was on the game analysis team. And what we've found, we pretty much always test lane Xin every time we make significant changes to his jungle pattern or like to his spells or whatever. And in the past, our conclusion was often that we either didn't have time or didn't feel super comfortable enabling a laning pattern for him, and so we made his mana costs very high and or nerfed his wave clear. I think sometimes both, because the perspective at the time was often about, hey, getting this balanced for lane and having it not be degenerate would be really hard. And so what we'll do is just give him high mana costs and make sure his wave clear isn't amazing. And if we do both of those things, if he's good in lane, it won't be degenerate because he won't be able to just spam all in you because his mana costs are high, and he won't be able to spam shove you in because his mana costs are high and his minion damage is not super high. And so that's never been the focus, right? Like, I'm not saying that the designers who worked on those in the past were like, we can't have lanes in at all. It was more just, hey, their goals didn't involve lanes in, and they did things to deliberately make lanes in worse intentionally because they didn't believe that they had the time in order to make sure that lanes in was not degenerate. And so they did things to say, if it was good with these things in, it would not be degenerate, right? Because of the limiting his repeatability. I've talked about this before, but one of the ways that we actually make sure that jungle, often junglers, but just champions in general that have very, very powerful all-in patterns or very powerful deterministic trading tools or all-in tools, this is things like Warwick Q or Trundle E, are not degenerate in lane, is by giving them very high mana costs. And it's okay for them to be really powerful in the jungle, and the mana costs don't really matter there, and that's totally fine because the jungle camps don't really have to have a trading pattern, right? They're just, they're just AI. And fighting them is not a super critical important part of the game. It's not the part of the core loop of the game that the combat with jungle monsters is interesting, whereas lane gameplay actually does have to be interesting. And so we give these spells really high mana costs, and it has ended up that Warwick and Trundle top over the years have often been pretty good. Not necessarily saying that's true right now. I don't know what the current state is right now. But Xin has never really come to the point where he's been a super strong laner. But that might change, right? Like maybe the new builds enabled by S2 will be stronger in lane. Legitimately, I don't know. But having talked a little bit with the designer who worked on those changes, his perspective was like, I just want this build to be good. If it has to go in a lane to make it good, that's fine with me. That was his perspective. And so you might be seeing some of that in the future, which is, it's kind of interesting to get this question at this point, just because I happen to be making this video as the S2 stuff is on the PB, but this question was asked long before any players got a look at those changes, which is cool. So that's the answer I have for you. What item system are you the happiest with right now? So I'm going to answer this question in two separate ways. Number one is from my personal perspective, right? Just, me as a person. And the second is sort of if I zoom out and I sort of look at it from a systems designer perspective, like how do I think about the systems, like which systems are performing their role most well, or like doing the things that they need to do most effectively and supporting all of the champions that they need to support in the best ways. And so talking about my personal perspective, I think it's pretty easy which one am I happiest with. It's the AP system. I did the AP system changes in season 14, and while I recognize that there are definitely still flaws in the AP system and that it definitely could be better, I think that the fact that most of the like most champions, right, especially most mages, have a couple of first items, or in some cases actually like 3 or 4 items in the first couple of slots that they're actually pretty excited about, right? You think of things like Blackfire Torch on some of our control mages or dot mages, right? You think of Malignance on a bunch of our ult skewed champions, right? Like the Luxes and the Aries of the world. You think of Shadow Flame on a lot of champions that want to try to burst you, or Horizon Focus on our artillery mages, where it's like we have a lot of items that feel really good for the champions that are supposed to buy them. And to me, the AP system today is such a big improvement on the previous iterations of the system that we had that I'm very happy with it. Partially because I am the person that like shaped the system the way that it is today, and I think it's such a big improvement. Right, one of the things I think I've mentioned this in a previous Q&A, but I did or maybe it was on stream. I don't remember. It doesn't really matter. But I did when I was doing like starting work on the items that I was making for the current season. This was last year when I was starting work on there. I did an assessment of our various item systems and like where I thought they were in terms of like accomplishing the goals and the needs of the champions that are in that system. And I remember I actually rated the AP system on that metric reasonably highly. It was not the highest rated system, but it was, I think, in the top 3, if I remember correctly, of the like super systems. And I remember every single time I showed the sheet to someone, like especially a lot of the older designers that have been around for a long time, they would do a double take, seeing that like the AP system can't be that good, can it? And then think about it for a little bit. No, actually, it is. Like it is hitting all of these goals, right? And I think a lot of the reason why I'm so happy with the AP system from a personal perspective today is that the AP system has been in our like lowest quality systems, like super systems, like in the item shop for a long time, right? Even don't even think even before the Mythic era, right? You look back at like, yeah, this is the AP system where every single mage buys Morellos every single game and isn't really happy about it because it just gives them some kind of boring stats and grievous wounds they don't really care about. And then their second item is something they also don't really care about. And then you go. There's so many different versions of the AP system that were kind of unexciting, uncompelling, like no real exciting fantasy items in the AP system, and we've really expanded that a lot, where there are so many more core fantasy items that work really well for a lot of our AP champions in the current game that just didn't exist or didn't exist in their current form. Even 4 years ago, right? And so many of the improvements that I was able to make, right, like Shadow Flame, for example, today is such a more exciting item than it was, in its original form, when it was made during the Mythic era. So, from a personal perspective, I really, 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 really love how much the AP system has improved. Even though I recognize from sort of an objective standpoint, it's still not our best system. It is much improved from where it was, though. Now, talking about like from a systems designer sort of zoomed out perspective of which systems are performing their functions most well, and like which one do I think is number one, I actually think my top picks, I think it's a pretty close toss up for me between the income tank system, right? This is the tank items for like junglers and top laners, basically, like not talking about the support tank system, and the fighter system as a whole. The reason why I say those two in particular is that the fighter system is always, always struggling to make sure that fighters are able to do a lot of different things. They need to be effective on one item. They need to be able to buy items to help them team fight later on in the game. They need to get a lot of damage and survivability. The fighter system has to do a lot of things, and it is actually doing all of those things right now, right? If you look at take a random fighter, say like Jax or something like that, it's like, okay, so he gets Trinity Force. He's really strong on one item. He can start killing people. He later on can buy a variety of different items, right? Like obviously Jax in particular has access to Zonias and stuff like that. But even if Zonias didn't exist or he couldn't buy it or whatever, right? It's like you look at other random fighters, like, oh yeah, Styrax exists, and it is a good third item or fourth item for some of these champions. You can buy a lot of health on your items to help you survive larger scale fights, right? You get pretty tanky as Darius or whatever, even if you're not buying tank items, right? You think of a Darius build that's like Stride Breaker, Black Cleaver, Sundered Sky, whatever, right? Like insert your favorite, random fighter items that you can buy. Uh, you can get all of the things that you need in the fighter system in a number of different ways. Is it perfect? No, absolutely not. But it works, right? It works for accomplishing the goals that those champions need, which is actually really impressive because the fighters need a lot more from the item system than most of our other classes, right? They're more item dependent than most of our other classes. And so the item system serving them in that way is actually pretty impressive. The reason why I say the income tank system is actually close, I think, is that the income tank system does a lot of things really, really, really well right now. In particular, it gives a lot of depth of optionality to tanks in such a way that you can navigate the game very, very, very differently from tank to tank and game to game, and actually get very wildly different results, which is actually pretty important for tanks, that they have a level of control and freedom over how they choose to be powerful, who they choose to be powerful against. And our current current set of options for them is actually really good for that, right? Of course, there's Kaenic Rookern, right, which is a big part of this. Of like, yes, this helps you one-stop shop your way against magic damage really effectively, especially poke. But there's also Visage, right, which can be really good for some tanks, especially in some situations where maybe you don't need as much MR, but you do really want to buff your shielding and healing. We have a number of item synergies, which can be really interesting, right? We have damage options, right, like Heartsteel and our Cinder items, if you want those. We have the team fighting Unending Despair, right? You get ahead and you get an Unending Despair. You can be really tanky on two items, right? You get really ahead and you just want to be as tanky as possible. You can get a Jack Show, right? You have so much depth, I think, and even some of the ability for them to poach some of the tank support items, I think, can be good here, right? Like they can dip in, some of these champions can buy a Locket and actually be pretty happy with that at certain points in the game. And some of them can buy a Zeke's and be pretty happy with that, early or in second slot or whatever, right? I think a lot of the depth, the depth is actually really important for the income tank structure to work. Again, none of this is to say that every single individual item is perfect, right? Like as an example, I think Sunfire is not in a great state. It's just not very satisfying. That could definitely be improved. But I think the system as a whole has the right parts, has the right components, and the right structure to make it so that tanks have the right decision structures available to them. They have the right tools available to them in the item system to be able to navigate the game correctly and give themselves better odds of winning depending on like how they're able to build, which is really important for tanks. And it's very difficult to create that structure and actually make it work. And so I'm very happy with that as a systems designer, looking at that, from the outside and saying like, yeah, that structure does actually really work. And it actually does support exactly what income tanks need to do in League to function. And so that's how I would sum it up, is like, don't really have a super confident saying, a super confident assessment of like which one is better. Is it the AD fighter system? Is it the income tank system? But I think they're both doing really, really well right now, structurally speaking. Again, not to say that every single individual item is perfect. They're not. But from a structural perspective, I think they are both really, really, really solid in the current game. How does Riot decide to revert changes? Talking specifically about LeBlanc, Rengar, Horizon Focus, etc. So this is something that I think players probably ascribe a lot more weight to than we do internally. I think from an internal perspective, looking at this, it's kind of, if you can display through argument, whether that's driven by data or other other supporting corroborating evidence here, that something that we had in the game before, a previous version of something, was better than the current version, and you can make that argument reasonably well enough, it's really not a big deal to do these reverts, right? As an example with Horizon Focus, this was almost trivial for me to do. All I had to do was basically show, hey, the item currently is being purchased by basically only Vlad. The previous version was not only a core item for multiple artillery mages, but it was a splash item and a fantasy item that could sometimes be purchased by the rest of the artillery mages, and was even being reached out by some of the other champions that like either splash into the artillery mage fantasy or have other reasons why they might want it, right? This is like, it was like Hui and Ari were purchasing this version, the version of Rise of Focus that is back on live, the reverted version. Um, at points in time, they were interested in that effect, the stat line plus the effects. And so it was very easy for me to say, hey, look, the current version is clearly not working. It is not doing what it was supposed to do. The previous version, while it also wasn't perfect, clearly did fill a really valuable space of the artillery mage item. It was bound to very core fantasy binding for like Zerath and Vel'Koz. And then you could splash it as your your Ziggs, your Lux, etc. if you wanted to, and that was a positive, right? Like we looked at that very very positively, and so it was very easy for me to say while I was working on my items project, let's just put it back to the way that it was. Champions, of course, are a bit more of a larger game here, and I think it's a little bit less clear cut. And this is something where I don't recall the exact specifics, but my recollection is that I think both Azu BK and August, who are the ones who did the LeBlanc and Rengar reverts, August for Rengar and Azu BK for LeBlanc, I think made a lot of arguments around like, look, these champions are not only picked less, but they're banned essentially an equivalent amount. They show up an equivalent amount in our frustration surveys, and their depth is lower, right? For those who are not familiar with the breadth versus depth, depth is basically like how, like on any, how much does a given player play that champion? Like a player of that champion, how much do they play them, right? Breadth is how many different players play a champion, and then depth is basically of the players that are playing them, how many games they actually put in. So like as an example, like Briar has extremely high depth. I think she's actually number 1 in the current patch, I believe. And you might look at a champion like Yasuo as being a really really high depth champion. But when we were doing these reverts, I think one of the strong arguments was, hey, not only are they just picked less, but their depth has gone down a lot in both cases on the Rengar and LeBlanc sets, and they weren't less frustrating, which was part of the motivation to do the changes to both of them. I think LeBlanc is a particularly sharp example of like, she was probably actually more frustrating. She was, I believe, banned more after the changes. I'm not 100% sure about that. It's been a long time. But I believe she was actually more frustrating after the changes because she would basically tell you, hey, you're dead, but you don't actually die for another 1.5 seconds or whatever the cook time was. So she would tell you that you were dead, but there wasn't really a lot of gameplay there to actually like determine if you were going to live or not. And this version, the version, the swim Rengar, the alternate Q version of Rengar that we had, also didn't seem to be meaningfully less frustrating either than like Rengar jumping on you and instantly one-shotting you. And so they were largely kind of viewed as, look, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of evidence that showcases that the previous versions of these champions were just better. They were played more, people liked them more, and they didn't seem to be more frustrating. In fact, the new version, I think, again, specifically with LeBlanc, might have even been more frustrating than the previous version or the modern version, the reverted version of LeBlanc. So ultimately, I think if you want to revert something internally, it's mostly just a matter of showcasing, hey, I think this previous thing was better for A, B, or C reasons, or maybe A, B, and C reasons. And if the evidence is there, or you make a compelling argument, that's really all there is to it. It doesn't take much else besides that. It's not like we have this crazy strong attachment to the exact way that things must be on live. I think I'm not sure this is really true, but like my perception of the way that people talk about this is that people have this perception that Riot really doesn't want to go back on the things that we do. It's like, no, we don't want to go back on things that we did that we believe still have value in the current game. But if we did something, and the value that we're trying to get clearly wasn't worth the price, we'll just revert it, right? We'll just take it out, or we'll just change it, right? It's like, look at Chemtech terrain, right? It's like, yeah, this was not working. We'll take it out, we'll rework it, and now you get modern Chemtech terrain, which actually is awesome, right? And so, like I said at the beginning of this, I think that players ascribe a lot more sort of weight to this than I think we do internally. We don't have like an official revert process. It's mostly just a matter of someone seeing the opportunity, presenting their evidence, and then we either do it or we don't. And that's really all there is to it, I would say. What sort of things go a long way in humanizing other players on your team or the opposing team? This was a longer post that was talking about like rage, fist bumps, the sorry interact. And I do want to be clear before I even get into talking about this. I am not an expert on this topic, right? This is pretty firmly a UX design topic. And while I am familiar with the very basics of UX design, I am a game designer, not a UX designer. And so I will not be trying to like go super in depth on this and explain deep concepts that I'm not super familiar with myself, like not an expert on. But I can sort of talk about the topic from a cursory perspective, I will say that we actually have a term for things like the fist bump and the sorry interact, and even some of the things that happen in game, right? Like leashing, for example, back when that existed, is largely considered pro-social design, right? Like essentially design that forces players to interact in a way that is positive for them, right? As an example, let's suppose that uh, we gave everyone a version of like singed passive, right, where you get near someone and it activates and goes on cooldown. And every 10 minutes you're allowed to get near someone and it gives you 50 gold or something like that. That would be pro-social design in a lot of ways of, hey, when you guys get together and get close together, you both get a reward. You both get to get 50 gold. And that's cool. You get to see your allies like, oh, your jungler comes up top and high fives you for 50 gold. Right? That'd be an example of pro-social design. I'm not saying we should do that because obviously there's a lot of other implications about what that would mean for the game. But that kind of thing, there's a whole not only school of thought around it, and to some extent a whole design field that's touches upon this area, but there's a whole area here where, as an example, one of the reasons why leashing wasn't removed from the game for so many years, even though it clearly had some downsides, was that it was believed, hey, this is one of very few examples of pro-social design between laners and junglers, right? Where the laners pay a very small cost to help out their jungler, right? And the jungler feels good about that. And then the jungler can theoretically like pay them back by ganking their lane or whatever, right? Now, as the cost became higher and higher, as people optimized the level 1 more and more and more, and other things changed, right? Starting imps got more powerful, et cetera, et cetera. Right? There were lots of other systemic changes. But as the costs got higher and higher, we decided, okay, this is not worth it anymore. Even though, yes, it is pro-social design, it's not worth the cost of maintaining it because it is causing friction in other areas of the game. And the again, like I said, it's really the end of it is just the cost was not worth what the value that we were getting out of that pro-social aspect of leashing. But imagine a world where we really wanted to go hard on those pro-social aspects. One of the things we would probably do is say, hey, actually, the wave doesn't even meet. You pay no cost in your level 1, and you just get to leash for your jungler in a way that makes the jungler feel good. If we were willing to pay the other costs associated with that for the game, right? Like basically, which would mean the game is longer and we lose some of the interest of level 1s and stuff like that. But we don't have to get into that. What I'll say is that I don't necessarily know, like getting to what this question was asking specifically, what goes a long way to humanizing the other players. I don't think it's about like this kind of design most of the time is about like one thing that's going a long way. I think the best versions of these that I'm familiar with in other games are small things that add up, right? Look at like FF14, for example, like having the sprout tag so you can see new players and the new players getting treated differently because they're marked as a new player, as an example, is like, oh, that's an example of pro-social design that works really well for FF14, but it's just a marker that then lends itself to players acting slightly differently in more pro-social ways when they interact with those kinds of players, right? And that is not the only part of that system that works, right? Like you layer that on top of like the mentor system, which obviously has its own problems in FF14, right, et cetera. But you get my point here. Is it's not one exclusive thing. It's not like we're going to re-add leashing and it's going to be amazing and now everyone is going to have a great time with their jungler and they'll never flame them, right? It's if we wanted to do an amazing job of this, we would have to build it into the game in more than one place, right? And it's something that historically we haven't prioritized highly over the best possible gameplay, the most competitive possible gameplay. Other games have different priorities, and so they, other games prioritize like, hey, this might make the game less competitive, but it'll also have pro-social interactions as a part of it. And therefore, we're going to do that. And historically, League has not prioritized those things. I personally do think that there are areas where we could probably just get pro-social gameplay without compromising, really. And I think we should explore those. But I'm also not an expert on the topic, so I can't really speak too much to that. But ultimately, my thoughts are, I think that League could do a better job in the actual core gameplay loop itself of encouraging pro-social behavior. We can also do things, beginning in champ select and in end of game that could make it feel better to interact with your teammates, like encourage more pro-social activity, in behavior, inside and outside of game. And we've done some of those things over the last few years, even, right? Like things like the fist bump and the sorry interact are examples of stuff that we've tried to do in that space. And I think Fist bumps, especially in some regions, have worked out really well. Something people don't know necessarily is that some regions actually use the fist bump way more than others. So if you're a player on NA, which I believe off the top of my head is one of the lower usage rate regions, you might not be super familiar with it as like, and not don't really think about it as a pro-social tool. But as an example, I believe some of the regions, like I think this could be wrong, but I believe like Korea, as an example, actually uses the fist bump quite a lot per game. And so it actually is really working for them as a pro-social interaction tool. And so, hey, maybe the end, the end game here is actually that we just need to make, 5 more of these types of systems, and they'll work for different types of regions or different types of players, and that will be great for encouraging these kinds of pro-social interactions. I don't know. I don't have a super strong opinion on it. It's not my area of expertise, but hopefully this was illuminating for you. Camille E with a more functional laning version that evolves to the current version as Camille levels like Kale passive. So this is an interesting concept, but there's a lot of things about it that immediately set off alarm bells in my head that are ringing off around like, I don't think that this would actually work. There's a number of reasons why. One being, if you look at our evolve spells in the game, you might notice that all of them are enhancements to the existing spell, right? They're not fundamentally new, like completely new paradigms of behavior. It's like, oh, Kaisa's E says you move faster, you lock yourself out of attacking, and at the end you get a big AS steroid. Okay, now it also gives stealth when you evolve it. That's that's like maybe the closest example to like completely new functionality, right? But the problem with Camille E is that the base spell isn't really that functional in the modern top lane shape, right? And so adding something to that spell over game time doesn't solve that problem, right? It's not like, oh, Camille being able to pull herself to a wall is a good spell at a baseline or something that's going to help you be functional in lane. And we're not going to give her a completely new spell that has a completely different set of properties, especially like, I imagine maybe what they were thinking, this person when they were asked, they were putting this in the Discord or like asking this question was, oh, maybe it's like you shoot the E2, the E1 at them in the beginning of the game and it like deals damage or slows or something. That's like, well, that introduces a lot of extra decision making complexity and a lot of extra optionality that we might not necessarily want later on in the game for Camille, because that might mean that we have to make her E2, like the actual like hook shotting into people, less powerful because you have other options available, right? Because keep in mind, everything has to be balanced, right? And so anytime we add extra options, if we did have a version that we thought was like functional in lane but could maintain some of the same shape of the spell later on, we have to consider that we'd then be actually adding real power to Camille in terms of options later on. Options are power, right? Even if the option is usually worse than just, hook shotting to a wall and then hook shotting back onto the enemy that you're trying to go for. The reality is options are power, right? This is the same reason why in Magic the Gathering, or basically any card game ever, drawing more cards is more powerful. Even in card games where you can only play one card per turn, or you're heavily limited in how you can actually leverage those extra cards, it's still more powerful to have more cards because options literally translate into power, right? Even if each additional option is only an average of 1 to 2% more power, that's still power, right? And so the thing that kind of makes me look at this and say, like, it's an interesting suggestion, but I think it's just immediately doomed, is we wouldn't actually want to sacrifice Camille's hookshotting power later on in the game in order for her to have a more functional, a higher optionality tool early on in the game. And the reason why we're not just going to say, like, the E is a completely different spell is we then have to, like, figure out how to communicate that to everyone in the game and, like tell the narrative of, like, why are you losing access to a tool that you had in the laning phase and instead getting a different tool later on in the game that might be better in some situations and worse in others. We upgrade our spells as just universally they are better for good reasons, and I think that there are a huge number of problems with this idea just at face value that make me think it's just kind of a non-starter for going on down this path. Ultimately, my perspective is just, yeah, I think that we should just reshape the top lane, not just for our terrain interaction champions. This is like Camille, Alawi, Poppy, etc. But also because one of the things we've discovered over the years, probably not surprising, is that Fights in the open are some of the least interesting possible fights that you can have. This is one of the reasons why minions have a lot of value to the laning phase, is that they create context, and this is one of the reasons why like minion block does have some value, is that it essentially creates terrain for both players, temporary terrain, but it is terrain nonetheless. But part of the value of like having the jungle and the river and like having a lot of terrain on the map, like you'll notice there's really not very many large open spaces in the League of Legends map in general, and it's because combat in those large open spaces tends to not be very interesting. We made this top lane very open for other reasons, right, around like gank ability and like being able to see the jungler ahead of time, etc., etc. But there were other ways we could have accomplished those same goals besides making it a super open, combat area. And I personally think that it would actually be good for most top laners, and it would be more, combat would be more interesting. Whether they're buffed or nerfed is not important. It's just more about combat is probably a bit more interesting if there was more terrain to interact with in top lane, to play around. And I am generally of the opinion that a better version of top lane would be one where there's more terrain. Even if we don't consider champions like Camille, but of course it would be amazing for champions like Camille, Alawi, Poppy, etc., for us to bring back some of the terrain, the terrain closeness, or add more terrain to top lane itself. And so this is just something where I don't think that Camille herself is supposed to bear the burden of the change, right? Like I just think that in an ideal world, there's just more terrain for her to use top lane. What do you think would need to be done to AP Rakan mid, Viego mid, and Lilia top individually to keep them healthy in their main roles while ensuring they had a chance of viability in Masters Plus on Mars? So I think these are all three different cases, so I'm going to address them differently, starting out with Viego. This one's easy. Viego's already viable at Masters Plus MMRs. He's viable at all MMRs. One thing I'll note here is that I think this distinction for like Masters Plus MMRs is really fake. I don't actually think that somehow when you get super high in MMR, that magically a bunch of champions become completely unviable. There are champions that get worse, right? But when we're talking about like 1% to 2% win rate, it's like also, well, a lot of champions have builds or things that you can be doing to optimize them that also equate to like 1% to 2% win rate that most people aren't doing. It's like, okay, so if you tell me you just put in another 50 games on the champion, you gain 1% win rate, you overcome that disadvantage. Like, well, that champion is still viable. They're just worse, right? There's lots of champions that are worse but still viable than other champions. And so regardless, like I said, I don't think this distinction about Masters Plus is real at all. But Viego mid is already viable, right? There's it's not very highly picked, but there are mains and one tricks and people that even splash into it, right? Viego mid was played in pro a couple times last year, and I think it's pretty clear that if you do much investigation on Viego mid, it is already viable. Is it powerful? Is it the best thing you can be playing? No, absolutely not, right? But you can go look at Wix OPGG. You can see that he wins some games, he loses some games, but he does play a lot of Viego mid, and that's perfectly successful at Masters Plus MMR. I would say that this is something that maybe we could support better. Maybe we could make it feel better, feel different, but the power is not the main thing it's lacking. It could also be better, right? But not by that much. Ultimately, my perspective on Viego is just, yeah, it's already viable. Just go play it if you want to. Not too much else to say there. AP Rakan mid and Lilia top are different cases, though. Lilia top is one where, if I read the exact way this question is framed, what do you think would need to be done to keep them healthy in their main roles while ensuring they had a chance at viability? Not much. We would just need to lower her mana costs. However, the reason why we upped her mana cost was because she was unhealthy in top lane, not because she was unhealthy in her main role, and we wanted to preserve the healthy gameplay that she had in the jungle, right? This question doesn't really ask whether they'd be healthy in that role or not, right? Whereas that's something I would think we would definitely be concerned with if we were trying to enable it. And ultimately, my perspective on this is I think that the thing that makes her a compelling different kit in the jungle, right, the Q and Q passive loop, is the thing that makes Lilia top unhealthy as a top laner. And I see that as kind of fundamentally unbreakable, where one of them will be unhealthy. If both of them are viable, one of them will not. We will not be happy with one of them, most likely. And I actually don't see a way to break that, because I think that the core thing that makes Lilia interesting as a jungler is the Q passive loop. The whole kit is built on top of that. And that is the thing that makes her unhealthy as a top laner, is that she is always faster than her opponent and she can damage them without actually interacting with them. Like, she is outside of melee range and dealing significant damage to them. And that's kind of necessary for her to function as a jungler. So Lilia top, I suspect, is doomed. Not guaranteed, right? Like, there are, maybe there's someone has a really clever solution to that problem. of, oh, actually what we do is we give her a more powerful jungle mod on Q, and we lower the early Q damage so that when she Qs you, it's much less effective, and she has to scale in top lane to become less interactive, and you have to punish her in the first 5 levels or whatever. Maybe someone has a great solution like that around like power curve or something, in a way that is not. It does not disturb jungle much, or doesn't change jungle much at all. Maybe someone has a great solution there. I don't have one off the top of my head, but the actual answer to the question is like, all we need to do is lower the mana cost, but we would be very unhappy with the state of Lilia top if we did that, and so that's why we don't do it. Is that Lilia top at a from a base pattern level is not healthy. We would need to do other changes to make it acceptable, I think. Though who knows? That was a long time ago that we changed Lilia top, and so maybe it would be more acceptable today. We've done a lot of balance changes to Lilia since that point, so who knows, right? I'm not here to say that things are exactly the way that they are. One thing you'll find I note a lot in these Q&As is that things change over time, right? Things that were true 2 or 3 years ago sometimes change, right? Sometimes we make other changes, and then, that makes things that were true in the past no longer the case, even if they're not visible anymore. So hard to say. AP Recon mid is also an interesting case, though. This one I'm not sure about. I suspect that AP Recon mid is very similar to the Blitzcrank case, where when we enabled Blitzcrank in jungle, actually, I don't remember if I was talking about this before in this video or not. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. Well, I'll tell the story again anyway. But when we enabled Blitzcrank jungle, we had to give him a bunch of DPS, and that was effective against the jungle and effective, in the things that he needed to do as a jungler. But then we had to nerf things away from support because that DPS affected Blitzcrank in support. And so we had to nerf things that were support skewed in order to balance Blitzcrank. And we kind of came to the conclusion, this is not worth it. We are taking away things that Blitzcrank support players love in order to support Blitzcrank jungle, which most of the support players don't care about. We should just do a good job of supporting Blitzcrank support. I suspect that is a very, we'd end up in a very similar spot with AP Recon mid, unless someone had a really, really, really clever solve. Another thing I'll note here is that what we've historically found, for example, when we tested Rel, the initial version of Rel, right, where her E was not castable without an ally, having champions in lane, having champions in a role where one of their spells literally does not work, is something that I think we're pretty skeptical of on the whole, because you have a whole spell that doesn't work until your jungler shows up or something like that, right? And it's is that really the kind of kit that we want to spend time trying to support? I suspect we'd want to have a version of Recon E that is castable when you're on his own if we wanted to support AP Recon mid. I don't actually know how to solve this problem, right? The one that's framed by this question of what would you think would need to be done to keep them healthy in their main roles? Because I think we'd have to make a lot of changes to AP, to Recon, to make AP Recon mid functional in a way that we were happy with. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure how those would affect support, because a lot of it would depend on how we wanted to go about it, right? There's a version of this as an example where we say, oh, actually what we're going to do is we're going to have a new effect on Q where when you kill a unit with it, it does something new. It heals you, or it refunds part of the mana cost of the cooldown or whatever, right? It's okay, well, that probably doesn't affect support too much, right? Obviously, there's times when it would when you're targeting a minion or whatever, but that's maybe okay. Is that good enough to make some Recon mid healthy and viable? I'm not sure. Maybe. But there's a couple of small things I could see having very minimal impact on support, but I'm kind of skeptical that they would be enough to support AP Recon mid. And I'm also skeptical about the pick in general, as long as the E is uncastable without a nearby allied champion, because that kind of spell we've historically found, if you have that kind of spell, trying to make you feel viable in the role for most players is unlikely to work, because players will pick it up and say, I literally can't cast this spell. I don't want to play this champion, even if the pattern of the other spells works really well for them. So this is one where I don't have a great, straightforward answer for you, but maybe there is something out there. This one I think is, I would say AP Recon mid is probably more likely to be functional, in a healthy way, or more able to be functional in a healthy way without disrupting Recon's core pattern than Lilia top, I would say. So that's my perspective on these. I would say. Where does enabling a champion's alternative playstyle fall in Riot's overall upkeep priorities and balance strategy for League of Legends? I'm a big believer in off-meta stuff being the lifeblood and soul of League's roots and how actually meta develop, but I know a lot of the time the answer is there are more important things to work on because dev hours are limited. I do say there are more important things to, well, I don't have to say there are more important things to work on, but I do often say one of the core limitations is that there are only so many dev hours. We can only spend time doing so many things. we have certain priorities and we do prioritize a lot of things. I will say, again, this is another case where this person asked this question long before the S2 stuff that's on the PB right now was available to the public. And so it was um, kind of funny to me in a way, putting this question in my doc, knowing at that time that we were literally working on some alternative play builds, right? Like the crit cannon stuff, the AP, or the, I guess it's on hit Xin stuff, and AP Ezreal, etc. Stuff for S2. But and I'm glad that the timing of this kind of lined up with me being able to talk about that while I'm putting this in my talking about the while I'm doing this Q&A. But I don't have a great answer to this question because we don't have like these are the top 10 priorities for League of Legends right now, this year in order, right? Like we don't have that, right? We have a lot of different teams that are resourced differently. Some of them have designers, some of them have engineers, some of them have Q&A, or sorry, not Q&A. What am I talking about? QA, quality assurance, not questions and answers. That didn't make sense. But different teams have different resources, and then they each have different priorities. They're given, goals to accomplish every year, and those goals vary from year to year, and the kind of resources that they have vary from year to year. And sometimes things get borrowed from one team or another, and there's trade-offs being made there. And so I don't have a great, answer. Like, to be honest, even I don't know who the right person to ask this would be, but like even take people who are in like the leadership of League of Legends wouldn't be able to give you, I don't think, a straight answer of like this is the exact priority level of enabling a champion's alternative playstyles. In general, what I'll say is we generally value this. We value champions having alternative builds, alternative playstyles, but we have never valued it above League being the most competitive experience possible. And so when these alternative builds and playstyles cause problems for the competitive experience, like say they're unbalanceable, or say they're causing problems for the main roles balance, right? Like, the Blitzcrank jungle example I was just giving, where it's like, hey, we tried enabling Blitzcrank jungle, it caused problems for support. Okay, we will cut Blitzcrank jungle. Blitzcrank jungle will no longer exist because we want support to be the best experience possible, right? Both from a competitive perspective and from a supporting Blitzcrank's actual core audience perspective, where most of his players are supports, right? And so I don't have a great answer for you. What I'll have to say is that there are a lot of people out there, a lot of designers out there in particular, that love supporting these things. Even, outside of designers, right? Like talk about producers, QA, engineers. A lot of people internally at Riot love these alternative builds, alternative play styles type things, and supporting them and making them function. But we've come to the conclusion over the years, sometimes by doing this, sometimes by not doing it, that it is generally best when we do these as smaller projects from time to time. When we've tried to do these in mass, it has generally not worked really well. When we've tried to force these super hard, it has also not really worked that well, generally speaking, right? You think of things like ADTF, for example, where it was like, oh yeah, we tried really hard to make ADTF viable. And what we did was we made a top laner with very low gameplay, right? Kind of a, agency vampire in the same way that like the Lilia top example I was just giving earlier was. Yeah, ultimately, we have found that these things tend to be at their best when they are more side projects or sort of additional riders and opportunity space, like opportunistically done when we have a really good pitch for them. Kind of similar to midscopes, right? One thing that people ask a lot is like, why don't you just midscope this champion or whatever? And it's like, well, historically, when we midscope a champion because we think they need a midscope and we don't have a compelling pitch to start with, it usually doesn't go that well. But when we have a midscope that starts with, hey, this champion isn't meeting their fantasy. This is, like Nico as an example. This disguise mechanic is not good enough. It does not meet the disguise mechanic fantasy. It needs to be more. It needs to be better. It needs to be more functional as an actual trickery disguise mechanism. That was what Flox said when he came in, and the Nico midscope was awesome, right? And I think a lot of the same thing is true for these like alternative play styles and like alternative builds and things like that. Of someone coming in and saying, hey, I think that, I don't know, what's the best recent example of this? Like AP Ezreal, right? Like this is one of the alternative build things that's in the in the S2 package. AP Ezreal has a place in League of Legends as a burst champion that has a really powerful ultimate and is much less about the base kit and is way more about hitting big ults on people. Okay, cool. right? And that seemed like it worked out in testing. Will that work out on live? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I wasn't really that involved in it, but uh, that's the kind of thing that I think is much more likely to lead to a positive outcome than, oh, let's, live pod, we're going to give you a task. You must enable 5 new alternate off builds by next patch. Like, that is not that likely to play out well. In much the same way that I think mid-scopes where we just tell someone to mid-scope someone for game health is generally have not worked super well. So that's kind of my thought on this topic. Why is Maokai top, which used to be his main role, allowed to be, or at least feel, so bad in favor of his other roles? And this person went on a ton of detail about like plates, builds, scaling, etc. about Maokai top, like all of everything. I didn't read through the whole thing. I just skimmed it. I didn't really find myself agreeing with much of what I read, but that's not really important. What I'm going to be talking about is more of the question, like the sort of summary of the question, which is like, were the other roles chosen due to play rate? The short answer is no. So the 2 other roles, which are support and jungle, for those of you not familiar with Maokai, are actually pretty different, right? Support, when this version of Maokai was made, right, the Maokai, the tank update was done, and Maokai was given this current ultimate, right, comparatively to the damage reduction one that he had previously, he was actually optimally played as a support immediately, right? That was the best thing you could be doing with the updated Maokai was support. And he received a lot of balance changes to move him back to top lane and make support much worse, and to the point where support ended up kind of non-functional at that time. And support kind of ended up going full circle, where after a lot of systemic changes and some balance changes to Maokai himself, support ended up being good again. In fact, it win rate wise ended up being from time to time better than his other roles. Particularly after the creation of Trailblazer, which had a particularly high synergy with Maokai support for whatever reason. I don't really have a great explanation for that. I guess it's just it does all the things he wants to do. Sure. Anyway. But support was not something that was intentionally supported, really. It's not something that we were offended by, like the way that it manifested more recently comparatively to the original version, right? The original version, when Maokai got the tank update, was like Emax, E-spammer, take complete control of the brush, and your opponents don't really get to play on the bottom side of the lane. That was not really considered super desirable, I don't think, gameplay-wise. But the modern version, where you just kind of W people and you're just very similar to other tank supports, but in a more Maokai way, I think we were pretty happy to support. But it was not something that we intentionally enabled. Jungle is very different, where it was intentionally enabled, but we have to be pretty careful about how we do that, obviously, as we've seen, because it turns out that when Maokai is a fast-clearing jungler, he dominates pro play, and just in general, high skill play kind of defaults to, Maokai is the champion to pick. Not that necessarily people will do that in solo queue, but it will be very clear that, Maokai is the jungler of choice when he clears sufficiently quickly, because he has a lot of reliable CC, he scales as a frontliner super well, but this was not a case of us deprioritizing Maokai top. In fact, what I'll say here is that, I'm not talking about the last year or so worth of data. I'm not as familiar with that. But last time I took a deep dive into Maokai data, the Maokai top lane play rate is not that different, or at least wasn't that different last I looked at it. So it could be different now. But did not change that much over the last 1 to 5 years, basically. And so my perspective on this is the reason why I was doing this investigation in the past was, one of the questions that we often ask with champions is, where is their play rate coming from? When you have someone like, like Nefiri is an example of this, like another champion we asked this question is, okay, when we enabled Nefiri jungle, did the players come from the jungle? Like percentage-wise, how many of the players came from people who already played jungle and just wanted to play Nefiri and didn't before, versus Nefiri players who previously played her in mid lane and moved to the jungle, right? It's always an interesting question. And with Maokai, the conclusion based on the data that I could see back, a year and a half ago or whatever, whenever I did this investigation, was Maokai's play rate in the other roles was not coming from Maokai top players. It was just jungle players and support players picking up Maokai, not Maokai players moving to the other roles. And so the conclusion at the time was, okay, Maokai top is roughly very similar pick rate. He's, the other roles are not eating Maokai top's pick rate. He's just not a very played top laner and really never has been. And so the conclusion was, okay, we could probably leave Maokai top as it is. It's probably fine. Maybe that's the wrong conclusion, right? But all of the data that we had access to at the time kind of suggested Maokai top was no worse off because of the tuning and balance we'd done for top and or sorry for jungle and support. Uh, Now, there's a whole different argument around feel, right? And if someone wants to tell me that Maokai top today feels worse than 5 years ago, I'm totally open to that. And I don't have a great solution immediately off the top of my head. But as for why has this allowed why has Maokai top allowed to be perceived as worse? Because the actual reality here, by the way, is that Maokai top is not weak at all, right? Again, this is a case where I don't necessarily know exactly on current patch, but there have been definitely patches over the past few years, even talking about the last 3 years, where Maokai top has been one of the most powerful top laners in the game, objectively, in terms of win rate, where if you wanted to win like 30 games in top lane, the best thing that you could be doing was just picking Maokai. Now, he's not necessarily the hardest top laner, and so if you wanted to win 100 games, you might want to invest in something that has a bit more depth to it, has a bit more mastery that you could get a higher ceiling on. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? Like in terms of pick up and play champions, and even for people who wanted to play 100 plus games, Maokai would still be a good option because he was just a really powerful top laner. But feel is a whole completely different animal here. And I think to talk about the feel, from a personal perspective, I've actually played a lot of Maokai top. As I mentioned, I was playing in the amateur scene back in season 5, season 6, when Maokai top was pretty clearly the best top laner in the game. And I've played a lot of Maokai because of that, not necessarily because I wanted to, but because I kind of had to, because he was just the best. And my perspective on this, even after the reshape, to his ultimate, because I've actually played him still a good amount top after that, is that I think that if we want him to feel more functional as a top laner, the things that were listed out in this post, talking about like his scaling, his builds, the plates, I actually don't think those really have a lot to do with it. To me, I think a lot of why Maokai doesn't feel like he's as effective as a top laner as he used to be, even though he is factually still really powerful, is because in the past, the things that Maokai did that were like considered to be like sort of unfair, no longer really feel unfair, even if they're still really powerful, right? Like back in the day, for example, Maokai QE used to build multiple Doran's rings, and your QE would just kill the backline instantly, and so it was very hard for enemies to interact with you. Nowadays, you're just really tanky and you scale actually quite well still as a tank. You have a really, really, really powerful 1 and 2 item spike, and you can frontline really effectively, much more so than other tank top laners at that point. And you also just have a lot of powerful gank setup, and a lot of other champions do either similar things or have ways to subvert those powerful things that Maokai does. And I think there are a lot of small things like clearing the wave on Maokai doesn't feel as good, and hitting 1 item on Maokai doesn't feel as good, even if factually you are still pretty powerful. And there are more matchups that can abuse you in the laning phase, partially because you don't have the ability to like one-shot the backline super easily in the same way that Maokai used to be able to do with a minimal investment into AP. I do also think that some of the first item changes are a little bit less exciting for Maokai. Even if they're similar power level, they're not quite as fun, or at least to me personally. And I don't necessarily know if these are all things. I'm just listing out some of the things that I will note about like why don't I play Maokai today is I think a lot of similar reasons to why I don't play some of the other tanks that I used to play, many, many, many years ago in top lane. But obviously some of them are doing better than others, like Shen, for example. It's like I used to play a lot of Shen. But Shen is still actually a fairly popular champion, and there's other reasons why I think people really like Shen. But Shen used to be much better at stalemating lane, back if you're talking about like season 6, season 7, than he is today, right? And that makes it would totally make sense to me if you were someone who played Maokai because he was really good at stalemating people in season 7 or whatever 7, 8, 9. I could totally believe that this version of Maokai top is less fun because he's less good at stalemating lane. I don't really have a great solution to that because I do think that it was probably not the most healthy thing how good some of our tanks were at stalemating people back then. But I could also agree with the other side around where hey, maybe some champions are too good at forcing in top lane and they're too good at denying people the ability to neutralize them. I could see that argument, right? I could see the argument that top lane has actually become too sharp over the years, and that the counters are in some ways too sharp. Although in some ways the counters are actually less sharp today than they used to be. Anyway, this has been a lot of rambling. I haven't, hopefully I've gotten a satisfactory answer here. Don't know if that's actually true, but yeah, hopefully this is at least useful or illuminating. But yeah, I guess to sort of summarize my thoughts ultimately, it's not really that it's not that he's bad, right? Maokai Top is not bad compared to his other roles. In fact, it's almost always stronger than Jungle win rate wise. And I would say, in terms of feel, we haven't prioritized top lane Maokai feel adjustments because he was never a very popular top laner, and it's not like he's degraded significantly in top lane pick rate. To be clear, this is not for lack of trying. We've tried a bunch of different. This is actually another tangent I'm going on, but I guess it's fine. But this is not for lack of trying. We've spun up a number of Maokai top explorations internally. These are just never shipped, or the versions of them that have shipped have only been very small scale changes. But I remember particularly well one that we did many years ago, back actually when Jat was a designer, because Jat typoed his max health damage that he had on the queue at the time. It was supposed to scale, I think, from like 5 to 9% or something like that. So the rank 4 was supposed to be 8% max health damage, but he typoed and it was actually 80% max health damage. And I remember this really well because there's this clip that we still have that we show people sometimes from back in the day where the Maokai with rank 4 rank 4 Q, W's forward, Q's the enemy top laner, and it just kills them from full HP pretty much because it is doing accidentally 10 times as much max health damage as possible because the decimal was misplaced by Jat. Anyway, we've tried stuff but never found anything that felt like it was a real clear win, and so we've not adjusted the feel of Maokai top because of that. And ultimately, it's not about the other roles being chosen due to play rate. It's that they get more balance changes because they need it, right? Maokai top doesn't really cause problems, whereas Maokai support and Maokai jungle have. And so that's why they get more changes. It's not about whether Maokai top was chosen, but more so, yeah, the other roles are also supportable, but they need more, they have needed more work to support. All right, last question for this video, which very conveniently is actually currently the last question in the doc, so I'll have to be restocking from the Discord for number 20, big number 20. Maybe I'll do something special for Q&A number 20. We'll see. But is Adaptive Force on select items like Imperial Mandate or Shirelia's Reverie a good potential avenue to help bridge the problem of we can't make AD supports because there are no items for them, and we can't justify making items for AD supports because there aren't enough champions who would actually buy them? Short answer is no. I think it's very, very easy for me to answer no, because the actual reality here is if it were as easy as make some sort of vaguely supportive shaped, Enchanter E shaped items that have some AD on them, we would have done it years ago. We've tested a number of different versions of AD support items. And one thing I'll also say is AD support items isn't really even good terminology because there's a lot of different subcategories here, right? There's AD carry supports, right? Like Varus or Jhin. There's AD caster supports like Ashe or Jace. There's AD assassin supports like Pyke and Pantheon and Rengar. There's Juggernaut supports, right? Like Set and Darius. There's diver supports like Camille and Vi. All these champions I've mentioned have either been viable in the past or been very close to functionality in the past. And they all actually have these different subclasses have different needs and wants, right? And so to even talk about AD support items, first of all, you have to establish which set of AD supports are you even talking about, right? Some of them share some needs, right? Like the items that the AD, like the Juggernaut supports would need are probably similar to what the Diver supports would need. But even beyond that, an item that is a couple of percent better for them than their current build is not going to be enough to make them viable. Something that I'll note, I don't think I talked about this last time I talked about AD support items, but I strongly suspect that we would need more than items. The reality is that items are not a good way to make supports viable because supports don't get very many items. They have the least gold in the game. And yes, we can make their items cheaper for them and we can make them very powerful by forcing them to interact with their allies in order to access the full power. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to solve the laning phase, for example, right? If you think of things like Set support and Camille support, when they were viable, it was mostly because the way that the bot lane meta was and the way that those champions were tuned at the time was they had a completely dominant early laning phase. and the rest of the game be damned, essentially, right? Like they didn't even have to worry about their scaling because they would just snowball through the lane really hard, right? And so like items don't help with that at all, right? Like the items that you buy, it don't even really matter for a lot of where these champions are powerful. And even changing their build path slightly has really little impact on this. Like, sure, I guess it's nice if it's Darius, you're playing Darius support, you get a kill, you get to buy Longsword Ruby Crystal instead of being forced to buy like Kindle Gem or something in order to buy, whatever your item is right now. I don't know what you would buy right now if you want to play Darius support. But you get what I'm kind of talking about here is like there's two separate issues here. Is like number one is that one singular like vaguely supportive item is not likely to make up the gap because most of these champions are very far out of viability, right? Like making up the gap on set support right now, for example, is more than 2%, right? Like, and you're not going to get much more than like I think it's very, very, very hard to get something out of a vaguely supportive item that's sort of okay, comparatively to your current itemization. Like 2% is asking a lot when the support doesn't even get their item for quite some time into the game. And a lot of the game, like a lot of the power of a support is actually determined by how useful they are in the actual laning phase before you even buy any items, right? And so you would need a really specialized item to help close that gap, something that will actually give them a lot of power, not an enchanter shaped item, which vaguely affects how your champion plays later on in the game after a lot of your usefulness has already been kind of set in stone before that item was purchased, right? And so I think there's a number of sort of problems with this this sort of thought process, and that's not even really getting into the part where it's like we probably wouldn't ever put adaptive force on these items because we don't actually want different champions and different systems to have access to all the same effects, right? For much the same reason that like we don't have an AD Zonias or an APGA. It's actually interesting when different types of champions have access to different systems, right? Part of what makes Mordekaiser interesting as a juggernaut is that his item build is very different from Darius, even though their game plan is really similar. And so that's that like, all the things I was talking about initially don't even get into talking about that, but that's another barrier here of like I just don't think we would ever do adaptive force on these items, and I also don't think it would really help. Maybe it might close the gap like 1 or 2% on say like Jhin support, but 2%, plus 2% Jhin support is still not viable. And so I think it would take likely, first of all, more than just items, and second, even if it was items, it would need to take a pretty extreme item that is very specialized at enabling these champions' patterns in the support role to get them more than 2%, even 3%, right? Like we're probably talking about an item that needs to buff these champions by like 5 or 6%, in order to get them into viability in these roles for a lot of them, right? And so that's kind of my conclusion here. Is no, I don't think this would be good enough. Even if we were willing to put adaptive force on items, which I don't think we'd really want to in this specific way. Again, I've talked about this before in other Q&As, so if you want to hear more about adaptive force on items, there are other questions I've answered where I talk about that more. I'm not going to get into it here. But yeah, this is going to be a wrap for Q&A number 19. And yeah, thanks for watching, and catch you next time in number 20 if you want to watch that too.